The autumn light filtered through the tall windows of Willowbrook Elementary, casting long shadows across the polished linoleum floors. Thomas Reyes pushed his cleaning cart slowly down the empty hallway, the familiar squeak of its wheels echoing in the afternoon quiet. At 57, he had perfected the art of invisibility, moving through the school like a ghost, noticed only when something needed fixing or cleaning. His weathered hands gripped the mop handle with practiced ease, decades of honest work evident in every callus and scar. The children had been dismissed 20 minutes ago, their laughter and chatter fading into memory as buses carried them home to warm kitchens and homework battles. Thomas preferred these quiet moments when the building settled into peaceful silence, when he could work without the curious stares or the occasional whispered comment about just the janitor. He'd grown accustomed to being overlooked, even found comfort in it. After all, invisibility was safer than scrutiny. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As he approached the third grade wing, Thomas noticed a small figure still sitting on the floor outside Mrs. Peterson's classroom. Lila Morgan, 8 years old, with tangled brown hair and a paint-stained sweater that had seen too many washes, sat with her back against the lockers. Her backpack lay forgotten beside her, and in her lap, she held a crumpled piece of paper covered in crayon drawings of houses, each one different, each one somehow sad despite their bright colors. "Hey there, little artist," Thomas said gently, parking his cart nearby. "Waiting for someone?" Lila looked up with eyes that seemed too old for her small face. They were the color of autumn leaves, flecked with gold and brown, but shadowed with something Thomas recognized from his own mirror, the weight of carrying secrets too heavy for young shoulders. "My mom's coming," she whispered, then quickly looked back at her drawing. "She's just running late again." Thomas crouched down, his knees creaking slightly. Up close, he could see the careful attention to detail in Lila's artwork, windows perfectly aligned, doors proportioned just right, tiny flowers drawn around each foundation. There was an architectural precision to her work that surprised him, a natural understanding of structure and space that most adults never developed. "These are beautiful houses," he said, meaning it. "Tell me about this one here." He pointed to a drawing of a 2-story home with a wraparound porch and a swing hanging from an oak tree. Lila's face brightened slightly. "That's the house where nobody cries," she said matter-of-factly. "The windows are big so the sunshine comes in, and there's a garden where you can pick flowers when you're sad. And see this?" She pointed to the front door, painted bright yellow. "The door is always open because happy people don't need to hide." Thomas felt something twist in his chest. The innocence in her voice, the way she described happiness as if it were a place you could live rather than a feeling you could lose, it reminded him of dreams he'd buried long ago. "That sounds like a perfect house," he said softly. "Is that where you'd like to live?" Lila nodded, then her expression clouded over. She glanced around the empty hallway, as if checking to make sure they were truly alone. Then, in a voice so quiet Thomas had to lean closer to hear, she said, "My mommy cries every night. I pretend to be asleep, but I hear her in the kitchen after she thinks I'm not listening. She tries to be quiet, but sometimes the crying gets so loud it wakes me up." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd expected typical 8-year-old concerns, friendship drama, forgotten homework, maybe worry about a sick pet. Instead, this small girl had just revealed a pain so adult, so raw that it took his breath away. "Oh, sweetheart," he managed, his voice rougher than intended. "I drew her this picture once," Lila continued, holding up a drawing of a woman with long, dark hair and a bright smile. "I wanted to make her happy, but when I gave it to her she cried even more. I don't understand why making something pretty makes people sadder." Thomas stared at the drawing, seeing not just crayon marks on paper, but a child's desperate attempt to heal wounds she couldn't comprehend. The woman in the picture looked tired even in Lila's generous interpretation, shoulders slightly slumped, smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Before he could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. A woman appeared around the corner, moving fast and looking frazzled. Miriam Morgan was petite like her daughter, with the same autumn-colored eyes, but where Lila's held innocent worry, Miriam's carried the weight of adult responsibilities. Her work uniform, a faded blue polo shirt with Morgan's Cafe embroidered on the chest, was stained with coffee and something that might have been syrup. "Lila!" "Oh God, I'm so sorry, baby." The afternoon rush ran late and then the coffee machine started acting up again. She stopped short when she noticed Thomas, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. She wasn't supposed to bother you." "No bother at all," Thomas assured her, standing slowly. "Lila was just showing me her artwork. She's quite talented." Miriam's expression softened as she looked at her daughter, who was carefully gathering her drawings. "She is, isn't she? Always drawing houses and families and—" She trailed off, something flickering across her face, a recognition that perhaps her daughter's art revealed more than she'd realized. "Come on, sweetheart," Miriam said, reaching for Lila's hand. "Let's get home. I need to start dinner and you have reading homework." As they walked away, Thomas heard Lila's voice drifting back down the hallway. "Mama, do you know Mr. Thomas? He liked my house pictures. He said the one where nobody cries was perfect." He watched until they disappeared around the corner, mother and daughter walking hand in hand toward whatever waited for them at home. But Lila's words echoed in his mind. "My mommy cries every night." Those 6 simple words had cracked something open inside him, something he'd kept carefully sealed for 15 years. That evening, Thomas sat in his small cottage on Maple Street, staring at the blank wall where his architectural degrees once hung. On the kitchen table lay a napkin from his lunch break, covered with sketches he'd drawn without thinking. Floor plans, elevation views, structural details that came to him as naturally as breathing. Even after all these years of pushing mops and emptying trash cans, his mind still worked like an architect, still saw potential in broken spaces. But potential was dangerous, hope was dangerous. He'd learned that lesson the hardest way possible. Still, as he prepared for bed, Thomas couldn't shake the image of Lila's drawing, the house where nobody cried. Somewhere in Willowbrook, a little girl was falling asleep to the sound of her mother's tears, dreaming of yellow doors and sunshine-filled windows. And for the first time in 15 years, Thomas Reyes wondered if maybe, just maybe, he might still have the power to build something beautiful from the ruins. 3 blocks away from Thomas's cottage, in a cramped apartment above Morgan's cafe, Miriam Morgan sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by a fortress of bills, receipts, and overdue notices. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the papers that seemed to multiply every time she looked away. Her laptop screen showed her bank balance in unforgiving red numbers. $247.83. The cafe below had been her dream once. 5 years ago, when David had still been around and full of promises about partnership and forever, they'd signed the lease together with such hope. The space had good bones. Exposed brick walls, large windows facing Main Street, a cozy layout perfect for morning commuters and afternoon browsers. They'd painted the walls sunny yellow, hung local artwork, and installed a vintage espresso machine that David had found at an estate sale. For 2 wonderful years it had thrived. Miriam's homemade pastries drew regulars. Her coffee was strong and perfectly brewed. And the cafe had become a gathering place where neighbors caught up over breakfast and students studied for exams over steaming mugs. She'd been proud then, confident in her ability to create something meaningful. Then, David left. Not gradually, not with warning signs she could have prepared for. One Tuesday morning, she'd woken to find a note on the kitchen counter and his wedding ring beside the coffee maker. "I can't do this anymore," the note had read in his familiar handwriting. "The pressure, the debt, the constant worry. I need to find myself. I'm sorry." By noon, his belongings were gone, along with $3,000 from their joint account, money earmarked for rent and supplies. Now, 18 months later, Miriam stared at the electric bill with its red final notice stamp and calculated how many customers she'd need tomorrow just to keep the lights on. The math was depressing. The morning rush that once filled the cafe had dwindled to a handful of loyal customers, and the afternoon crowd had been lured away by a new Starbucks that opened 6 blocks over. The vintage espresso machine David had been so proud of now made concerning grinding sounds, and she couldn't afford to repair it, let alone replace it. She rubbed her eyes, feeling the familiar burn of unshed tears. It was almost 11 o'clock, and she needed to be up at 5 to prep for tomorrow's service. But sleep felt impossible when her mind raced through worst-case scenarios. How long before she'd have to close the cafe entirely? Where would she and Lila live if she couldn't make next month's rent? The fear was a constant weight in her chest, making it hard to breathe. "Mama?" Miriam looked up to see Lila standing in the doorway, her small frame dwarfed by oversized pajamas covered in cartoon cats. Her daughter's hair was mussed from sleep, but her eyes were alert with concern. "Hey, baby," Miriam said, quickly shuffling the bills into a pile. "What are you doing up? You should be sleeping." "I heard the papers rustling," Lila said, padding barefoot across the linoleum. "Are you doing important work?" "Something like that," Miriam managed, forcing a smile. "Just paying some bills. Nothing for you to worry about." But Lila's perceptive gaze took in the red stamps, the worried lines around her mother's eyes, the way Miriam's hands trembled slightly as she closed the laptop. 8 years old or not, she understood more than Miriam gave her credit for. "Are we in trouble?" Lila asked quietly, climbing onto the chair beside her mother. "No, sweetheart, we're just figuring some things out." The lie tasted bitter on Miriam's tongue. They were in trouble. Deep, possibly insurmountable trouble. But she couldn't burden her daughter with that knowledge. Lila had already lost her father's presence in her life. She didn't need to lose her sense of security, too. Lila was quiet for a moment, then reached across the table for her art supplies. A coffee can filled with broken crayons and a stack of copy paper Miriam had brought home from the cafe. Without speaking, she began to draw, her small tongue poking out in concentration the way it always did when she was creating something important. Miriam watched her daughter work, marveling as always at the careful precision of her drawings. Tonight, Lila was sketching another house, but this one was different from her usual cheerful homes. This house had boarded-up windows and weeds growing around the foundation. Dark clouds hung overhead, and a small figure stood outside the front door, looking lost. "What's this one about?" Miriam asked gently. "It's the sad house," Lila said without looking up. "This is where people go when they run out of happy." The words hit Miriam like a slap. She stared at her daughter's drawing, seeing not just a child's imagination, but a reflection of their reality. Was this how Lila saw their life? As a house running out of happy? "Lila, honey, look at me." Miriam waited until her daughter's golden brown eyes met hers. "We haven't run out of happy. Things are just different right now. Sometimes grown-ups have to work through difficult problems, but that doesn't mean we've given up on being happy." "But you cry at night," Lila said with devastating simplicity. "Happy people don't cry when they think nobody's listening." Miriam felt the air leave her lungs. She tried so hard to keep her struggles private, to maintain the illusion of strength for Lila's sake. But children were more observant than adults often realized, and her daughter had been carrying the weight of her mother's secret sadness. "Oh, baby," Miriam whispered, pulling Lila into her lap. "Sometimes grown-ups cry because we're scared or worried, not because we're not happy to have you. You are the best, most wonderful thing in my whole life. Even when things are hard, you make everything better just by being here." Lila nestled against her mother's chest, and Miriam could feel the tension leaving her small body. "Will we be okay?" she asked in a small voice. Miriam closed her eyes, breathing in the smell of her daughter's strawberry shampoo. She wanted to promise that everything would be fine, that the bills would magically pay themselves, and the cafe would somehow recover. But she'd made too many promises already that she couldn't keep. "I'm working really hard to make sure we are," she said finally. "And no matter what happens, we'll face it together. You and me, okay?" Lila nodded against her shoulder, then pulled back to look at her drawing again. With deliberate strokes, she began adding something new to the picture. A small yellow door in the middle of the sad house, with light spilling out around the edges. "What's that?" Miriam asked. "That's hope," Lila said matter-of-factly. "Mr. Thomas at school says every house needs at least one place where the light gets in." Miriam frowned. "Mr. Thomas? The janitor?" "He's not just a janitor, Mama. He knows about houses and building things. He looked at my drawings today and he understood them. Really understood them, like he could see the same pictures in his head that I see in mine." There was something in Lila's voice, a respect and recognition that seemed unusual for a child talking about a school custodian. But before Miriam could ask more questions, Lila yawned widely, suddenly looking every bit her 8 years. "Come on, little architect," Miriam said, lifting her daughter and carrying her toward the bedroom. "Let's get you back to bed." As she tucked Lila in and kissed her forehead, Miriam thought about what her daughter had said. Mr. Thomas, who noticed things others missed, who saw meaning in a child's drawings, who somehow planted seeds of hope even in conversations about sadness. Maybe tomorrow she'd pay more attention to the quiet man who cleaned their school, this person who seemed to understand her daughter in ways that surprised them both. Back in the kitchen, Miriam stared at the bills for another hour before finally admitting defeat and closing the laptop. As she prepared for bed, she caught a glimpse of herself in the bathroom mirror. Tired eyes, shoulders curved with stress, the face of a woman who'd been carrying too much weight for too long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new impossible math, new moments when she'd have to choose between paying for electricity or buying groceries. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, she found herself thinking not about what she was losing, but about what Lila had added to her drawing. A yellow door spilling light into darkness, hope finding a way in even when everything else seemed lost. In his small cottage across town, Thomas Reyes lay awake staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the image of a little girl who drew houses where nobody cried, while her mother's tears echoed through their apartment walls. For 15 years, he'd convinced himself that his gifts were too dangerous to use, that trying to help only led to more harm. But Lila's words haunted him. "My mommy cries every night." Maybe it was time to remember that architecture wasn't just about building structures. Sometimes it was about building hope, one carefully placed element at a time. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of October weather that made Willowbrook Elementary feel smaller and more enclosed. Thomas arrived at work 30 minutes early, as was his habit, unlocking the building and turning on lights throughout the corridors. The familiar routine of preparing the school for another day usually brought him peace. But today he moved with restless energy, his mind occupied by thoughts of golden brown eyes and tearful confessions. As students began arriving for the day, Thomas found himself paying closer attention to details he'd previously noted but dismissed. Lila Morgan stepped off the school bus wearing the same paint-stained sweater from yesterday, now paired with jeans that had been mended at the knees with patches that didn't quite match the original denim. Her backpack looked heavy on her small frame, and Thomas noticed how she walked slightly hunched forward, as if carrying more than just books. During his morning rounds, Thomas made a point of passing by the third-grade hallway just as students were settling into their classrooms. Through the window of Mrs. Peterson's room, he watched Lila take her seat near the back, pulling out her homework with the careful precision that seemed characteristic of everything she did. But when Mrs. Peterson began distributing papers for a math lesson, Thomas saw Lila quietly tear a piece from her notebook and begin sketching instead. Another house, this one with dark windows and a crooked foundation. "Thomas." The sharp voice of Principal Evelyn Hart cut through his observations. Thomas turned to find her standing in the hallway, her arms crossed and her expression stern. At 62, Evelyn had been running Willowbrook Elementary for nearly 2 decades, and her authority was absolute and unquestioned. She was a woman who believed in order, proper procedures, and clear boundaries, especially when it came to staff members overstepping their designated roles. "Yes, ma'am?" Thomas kept his voice neutral, respectful. "I noticed you lingering outside Mrs. Peterson's classroom yesterday afternoon, and again this morning." Her gray eyes studied him with sharp intelligence. "Is there something you need to discuss regarding your custodial duties?" Thomas chose his words carefully. "Just making sure everything's clean and in order. Sometimes I notice things during the day that need attention later." "Things?" Evelyn's eyebrows rose slightly. "What sort of things?" "Spills, safety hazards. Children sometimes drop things or leave messes." It wasn't entirely a lie, though it wasn't the whole truth either. Evelyn stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Thomas, you've worked here for 8 years, and you've always been reliable and professional. But I want to be very clear about something. Your job is to maintain this building, not to monitor our students. If you have concerns about a child's welfare, you bring them to me or to their teacher. You don't take it upon yourself to investigate." The warning was clear, and Thomas understood it. In Evelyn's mind, he was just the janitor, a kind enough man, certainly, but not someone whose insights about children should be taken seriously. The hierarchy was rigid. Teachers and administrators made decisions about students' lives, while support staff stayed in their assigned lanes. "Of course," Thomas said simply, "I understand." But as Evelyn walked away, her heels clicking purposefully on the polished floor, Thomas felt something rebellious stirring in his chest. He'd spent 15 years accepting others, limited view of his capabilities, content to hide behind the safety of low expectations. But Lila's trust had awakened something in him that he'd thought was permanently buried. During lunch period, Thomas made his way to the cafeteria for his usual maintenance check. The room buzzed with the controlled chaos of elementary school dining, hundreds of small voices competing with the clatter of trays, and the occasional shout from a lunch monitor. He was replacing a burned-out fluorescent bulb when he spotted Lila sitting alone at the end of a long table. She'd unpacked her lunch carefully. A peanut butter sandwich cut into precise triangles, a small bag of apple slices, and a juice box that had seen better days. But instead of eating, she was scanning the cafeteria with those perceptive eyes, eventually settling on a boy 2 tables over who sat staring at an empty spot where his lunch tray should have been. Thomas watched, fascinated, as Lila made a decision. She carefully rewrapped half of her sandwich, picked up her bag of apples, and walked over to the boy's table. "Hi, Jeremy," she said quietly. "I brought too much lunch today. Want to share?" Jeremy looked up with surprise and embarrassment. "I'm not hungry," he mumbled, but his eyes fixed hungrily on the offered food. "I know," Lila said with the wisdom of someone far older than 8. "But my mom always packs too much, and I hate wasting food. You'd be doing me a favor." Thomas felt his chest tighten as he watched the interaction. Jeremy accepted the food with grateful relief, and Lila returned to her table, quietly eating her remaining half sandwich as if she'd done nothing extraordinary. But Thomas had caught something others missed: the careful way she chewed each bite, making it last, the way she saved her apple slices for the end of the meal. She wasn't sharing her abundance, she was sharing her scarcity, giving away food she needed because another child needed it more. After lunch, as students returned to their classrooms, Thomas found himself walking past the main office, just as Miriam Morgan hurried through the front doors. She was 20 minutes late for the scheduled parent-teacher conference that was posted on the office bulletin board, her cafe uniform wrinkled and her face flushed with exertion. "I'm so sorry," she was saying to the secretary, slightly out of breath. "The health inspector showed up unexpectedly and I couldn't leave until—" "Mrs. Peterson is waiting in room 12. The secretary interrupted with professional politeness, tinged with disapproval. "She has another conference scheduled in 15 minutes. Thomas watched Miriam's shoulders sag slightly as she hurried down the hallway. Through the window of room 12, he could see her sitting across from Mrs. Peterson, listening intently as the teacher spread out examples of Lila's work. Even from a distance, Thomas could read the tension in Miriam's posture, the way she leaned forward as if trying to absorb every word about her daughter's progress. The conference lasted exactly 12 minutes. When Miriam emerged, she moved more slowly, her face thoughtful and concerned. Thomas pretended to be adjusting a bulletin board display as she passed, but he couldn't help noticing the way she paused outside the building, taking several deep breaths as if steeling herself for whatever came next. It was then that Thomas made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. He stepped outside ostensibly to empty a trash can, arriving just as Miriam was climbing into a 10-year-old Honda Civic that had definitely seen better days. "Mrs. Morgan?" he called gently. She looked up, startled. "Oh, hello, you're Thomas, right? Lila mentioned you yesterday." "Yes, ma'am. I hope you don't mind me saying, but your daughter is a remarkable young lady, very thoughtful, very kind to others." Miriam's expression softened immediately. "She is, isn't she? Sometimes I think she's too kind for her own good, too aware of other people's problems." "That's not a fault," Thomas said carefully. "The world needs more people who notice when others are struggling." Something in his tone made Miriam study his face more closely. "You really see her, don't you? Not just as another student, but as a person with her own thoughts and feelings." "Children often see things adults miss," Thomas replied. "They haven't learned yet to look away from inconvenient truths." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Miriam was quiet for a long moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel. "Mrs. Peterson says Lila's been distracted lately. Not disruptive, just elsewhere. Drawing instead of doing math, staring out the window during reading time." She looked up at Thomas. "Did she seem upset to you? Yesterday, I mean, when you found her waiting?" Thomas chose his words carefully. "She seemed like a child carrying grown-up worries, but also like a child with a lot of love to give." Miriam's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "Thank you for being kind to her, for listening when she needed someone to talk to." As she drove away, Thomas stood in the parking lot watching her car disappear around the corner. He thought about Lila sharing her lunch with Jeremy, about Miriam's wrinkled uniform and apologetic rush, about the careful way both mother and daughter tried to hold their small world together despite whatever forces threatened to tear it apart. That afternoon, as Thomas cleaned the hallways after the final bell, he found himself stopping outside room 12. Mrs. Peterson had left, but Lila's artwork still covered a section of the bulletin board. Houses with perfect proportions, families with smiling faces, gardens full of flowers that seemed to reach toward the sun. But tucked in the corner was her newest drawing, the one she'd been working on during math class. This house was different. It had strong foundations and straight walls, but the windows were dark and a small figure sat on the front steps with her head in her hands. Thomas studied the drawing for a long time, seeing not just a child's art project, but a window into a world where hope and despair existed side by side. Lila was documenting her reality the only way she knew how, and her reality included a mother who cried at night, and a future that felt uncertain and frightening. Walking home that evening, Thomas found himself taking a detour past Main Street, past the row of small businesses that formed the heart of Willowbrook's downtown. Morgan's Cafe sat between a used bookstore and a barbershop that had been there since the 1960s. Through the large front windows, he could see Miriam behind the counter, serving coffee to the handful of customers scattered throughout the small space. The cafe had good bones, Thomas noted with his architect's eye. High ceilings, exposed brick walls, natural light from those large windows. But he also saw the details others might miss. The flickering fluorescent light above the register, the coffee stains on the wooden floor that spoke of a machine in need of repair, the empty tables that should have been occupied during the dinner rush. As he watched, a customer approached the counter to pay his bill. Miriam smiled and chatted pleasantly, but Thomas saw the quick, worried glance she cast at the nearly empty tip jar, the way her smile faltered slightly when she thought no one was looking. That night, for the second time in 15 years, Thomas pulled out his drafting supplies. He sat at his kitchen table with a blank piece of paper, a pencil, and the accumulated knowledge of 2 decades as an architect. And slowly, carefully, he began to sketch, not a grand building or an impressive structure, but a small cafe with possibilities, a space where hope might find room to grow alongside the coffee beans and homemade pastries. He drew until well past midnight, his hand moving with a confidence he'd forgotten he possessed. For the first time in 15 years, Thomas Reyes was remembering what it felt like to build something beautiful. But this time, he wouldn't be building alone. The cardboard box had been sitting in Thomas's bedroom closet for 15 years, gathering dust and painful memories in equal measure. He'd carried it from Colorado to Willowbrook when he'd fled his old life, but he'd never opened it since the day he'd packed it with shaking hands and tear-blurred vision. Tonight, with Lila's words still echoing in his mind and sketches of the cafe spread across his kitchen table, Thomas finally found the courage to confront what he'd spent so long trying to forget. The tape peeled away reluctantly, as if the box itself was hesitant to give up its secrets. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, lay the fragments of Dr. Thomas Reyes's former life. His diploma from the University of Colorado School of Architecture, magna cum laude, awards from the Colorado chapter of the American Institute of Architects, photographs of buildings he'd designed, a community center in Boulder, a series of affordable housing units in Denver, a small hospital in Fort Collins that had won recognition for its innovative use of natural light to aid patient recovery. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a manila envelope, were the newspaper clippings he'd saved despite himself. The headlines still had the power to make his hands shake. Structural collapse kills 2 construction workers. Investigation continues into Highland Plaza accident. Architect Thomas Reyes cleared of criminal charges. Cleared of criminal charges. The words should have brought relief, vindication, peace. Instead, they felt like salt in a wound that had never properly healed. Being legally cleared didn't erase the weight of responsibility that settled on his shoulders like lead, didn't silence the voices of 2 families who'd lost fathers and husbands because of calculations he'd approved, specifications he'd signed off on. Thomas spread the newspaper clippings across his kitchen table, forcing himself to read the details he'd memorized but tried desperately to forget. The Highland Plaza had been his most ambitious project. a mixed-use development with retail space on the ground floor and affordable apartments above. He'd been so proud of the design, the way it maximized natural light while maintaining structural integrity, the innovative use of steel and concrete that allowed for large, open spaces on the ground level. The construction had proceeded normally for 8 months. Thomas had conducted regular site visits, reviewed progress reports, signed off on materials and methods. Everything had been going according to plan until that Tuesday morning in March when everything went catastrophically wrong. A crane operator named Miguel Santos had been positioning a steel beam on the 3rd floor when the temporary support structure gave way. The beam fell, taking part of the scaffolding with it. Miguel and another worker, James Morrison, had been caught in the collapse. Miguel died instantly. James had lived long enough to be airlifted to Denver General, where he died 3 hours later from internal injuries. The investigation that followed had been thorough and devastating. Engineers from the State Safety Board had crawled over every inch of the site, examined every blueprint, questioned every decision. In the end, they determined that the collapse had been caused by a combination of factors: stronger than expected winds that morning, a delivery delay that had forced workers to use temporary supports longer than recommended, and a miscommunication between the construction foreman and the crane operator. Thomas's design had been sound. His calculations had been correct. The building techniques he'd specified had met or exceeded all safety standards. On paper, he bore no responsibility for the tragedy. But paper didn't account for the weight of what-ifs that pressed down on him in the dark hours before dawn. What if he'd specified stronger temporary supports? What if he'd insisted on different protocols for high wind conditions? What if he'd been on site that morning instead of in his office reviewing plans for another project? Miguel Santos had been 34 years old, married with 3 young daughters. James Morrison had been 26, newly engaged, saving money to buy a house with his fiancée. Their photographs had been in the newspapers alongside his own, their faces young and hopeful and forever frozen in time. The legal investigation had lasted 6 months. The emotional investigation, the sleepless nights, the panic attacks, the growing dependence on prescription painkillers to quiet the voices in his head, had lasted much longer. By the time his name was officially cleared, Thomas had already lost everything that mattered: his practice, his reputation, his marriage to Sarah, who couldn't watch him destroy himself with guilt over something that hadn't been his fault. "You can't save everyone," she'd said during their last fight, her voice breaking with exhaustion and frustration. "You can't take responsibility for every variable you can't control, but you're killing yourself trying to, and I can't watch it anymore." She'd been right, of course. But knowing something intellectually and believing it emotionally were 2 different things. Even after the state board cleared him, even after the family's insurance companies paid out settlements without pursuing further legal action, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he'd failed in some fundamental way. That somewhere in his plans, his calculations, his oversight, there had been a flaw he should have caught. So he'd walked away, sold his practice, donated most of his money to the victims, families, and disappeared into the kind of obscurity where no one would ever again trust him with decisions that could affect human lives. He'd become Thomas the janitor, Thomas the invisible man, Thomas who cleaned up other people's messes instead of risking the creation of his own. Now, sitting in his small kitchen with 15-year-old newspaper clippings and fresh sketches of a struggling cafe, Thomas felt the familiar weight of doubt settling over him. What if he was wrong about Miriam's situation? What if his intervention made things worse instead of better? What if his rusty architectural skills led to more problems than they solved? But then he thought about Lila's drawing of the house where nobody cried, about the careful way she'd shared her lunch with Jeremy, about the tears she tried so hard not to let her mother see. He thought about Miriam's tired eyes and apologetic rush, about the empty tip jar and the flickering fluorescent light that spoke of systems barely holding together. The Highland Plaza had been about ambitious dreams and complex engineering. This was different. This was about a small family, a simple business, a community that had already been forgotten by those with the power to help. The stakes were smaller, more personal, more manageable. Thomas picked up one of his sketches, a floor plan showing how the cafe's layout could be optimized to improve traffic flow and create a more welcoming atmosphere. His hand moved across the paper with unconscious confidence, adding notes about lighting improvements, seating arrangements, simple structural modifications that could transform the space without requiring major renovation. For the first time in 15 years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his skills could be used to build something up instead of carrying the weight of what had fallen down. The phone rang at 9:47 p.m., jarring Thomas from his memories. He almost didn't answer. Who would be calling him at this hour? But something made him pick up on the fourth ring. Thomas? This is Marcus Taylor. Marcus Taylor. Thomas hadn't heard that name in months, though they'd been friends once upon a time. Marcus owned Taylor's Hardware on Main Street, the kind of old-fashioned shop where you could still find exactly the right screw for a project that was 40 years old. He'd been one of the few people in Willowbrook who'd known about Thomas's background when he'd first arrived in town, but he'd never pressed for details or made Thomas feel like his past was something shameful. "Marcus," Thomas said, genuinely surprised. "It's been a while." "Too long," Marcus agreed. "Listen, I hope you don't mind me calling so late, but I was at Morgan's Cafe today, and Miriam mentioned that you'd been kind to Lila. Got me thinking about old times, about the projects we used to talk about when you first came to town." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Marcus, now hold on. Don't go getting defensive on me. I'm not calling to pry or to ask questions you don't want to answer. But I've been watching that cafe struggle for months now, and I've been watching Miriam Morgan work herself to the bone, trying to keep it afloat. And I can't help but think that maybe, just maybe, someone with your background might see solutions that the rest of us are missing." The silence stretched between them, filled with years of unspoken understanding and carefully maintained boundaries. "I know you came here to get away from all that," Marcus continued quietly, "and I've always respected that choice. But Thomas, that little girl, and her mother are drowning. And you might be the only person in this town with the knowledge to throw them a lifeline." Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of Miguel Santos and James Morrison's photographs in one hand, and Lila's drawing of a house where nobody cried in the other. "I don't know if I'm the right person to help," he said finally. "Maybe not," Marcus agreed. "But you might be the only person willing to try. Think about it, okay? And if you decide you want to take a look at that cafe with fresh eyes, give me a call. I've got some ideas about how the community might be able to support a renovation, if it came to that." After Marcus hung up, Thomas sat in his kitchen surrounded by the debris of his former life and the possibility of a future he'd never dared to imagine. Outside, Willowbrook slept peacefully, unaware that one of its most invisible residents was contemplating stepping back into the light. The brass bell above the door of Taylor's Hardware chimed softly as Thomas stepped inside, the familiar scent of sawdust and machine oil enveloping him like a welcome embrace. Marcus Taylor's shop was a testament to the kind of business that had once been the backbone of small-town America, shelves lined with mason jars full of screws and bolts sorted by size and type, walls hung with tools that could fix anything from a leaky faucet to a broken fence post, and behind the counter, a man who knew his customers by name and their projects by heart. Marcus looked up from the invoice he'd been reviewing, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile. At 61, he was built like a man who'd spent his life working with his hands, broad shoulders, calloused palms, and the kind of steady presence that made people trust him with their problems. His gray hair was thinning but neatly combed, and his work shirt bore the faded logo of the shop that had been in his family for 3 generations. "Thomas," he said warmly, setting down his pen, "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't sure either," Thomas admitted, glancing around the familiar space. "I told myself I was just coming in for cleaning supplies." Marcus chuckled, gesturing toward the industrial-grade cleaning products stacked near the back of the store. "Feel free to browse those if it makes you feel better. But I'm hoping we can talk about more interesting supplies than floor wax and disinfectant." Thomas had first met Marcus during his second week in Willowbrook, when he'd needed basic tools for minor repairs in his rented cottage. He'd been drawn to the hardware store partly by necessity and partly by nostalgia. The shop reminded him of places he'd visited with his father as a child, when problems had simple solutions and a trip to the hardware store could fix almost anything. Marcus had been patient with his questions, helpful with his projects, and gradually they'd begun talking about more than just hammer weights and nail sizes. Thomas had been careful never to reveal too much about his background, but Marcus was perceptive enough to recognize that his new customer understood construction and design at a level that went beyond casual DIY projects. "You know," Marcus had said one afternoon about 6 months after Thomas's arrival, I've been in this business for 40 years, and I can usually tell the difference between someone who knows how to swing a hammer and someone who knows why the hammer needs to be swung in the first place. You've got the eye of someone who's built things that mattered. Thomas had deflected the observation with a joke about beginner's luck, but Marcus had simply nodded and never pressed for details. It was one of the things Thomas appreciated most about him, his ability to see without prying, to offer support without demanding explanations. Now, 8 years later, Marcus was studying Thomas with the same patient perception, waiting for him to find the words he needed. "You mentioned the cafe," Thomas said finally. "Tell me what you know about Miriam's situation." Marcus leaned against the counter, his expression growing serious. "What I know and what I suspect are two different things. What I know is that the cafe has been struggling since her husband left. Fewer customers, more competition from that new Starbucks down the street, equipment that's breaking down faster than she can afford to fix it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What I suspect is that she's maybe 2 months away from having to close permanently, maybe less. She's too proud to ask for help directly, but I see the signs. The way she counts out exact change when she buys supplies here, the way she's been cutting back on inventory, the way she looks when she thinks nobody's watching." Thomas nodded, recognizing the picture Marcus painted. "And Lila?" "That little girl is something special," Marcus said, his voice softening. "Smart as a whip, artistic in ways that remind me of—" He stopped himself, but Thomas caught the implication. "Ways that remind you of what?" "Of the sketches you used to bring in here," Marcus said quietly. "When you'd explain a project you were working on, you'd draw on the back of receipts or napkins. Same kind of natural understanding of space and proportion that I see in Lila's artwork when her mother brings her in here." Thomas felt a strange mixture of pride and melancholy. She is talented, more than she probably realizes. "Which brings me to my point," Marcus said, moving to the window that faced Main Street. "Come here, tell me what you see." Thomas joined him at the window, looking out at the row of small businesses that formed the heart of Willowbrook's downtown. The view included the used bookstore where Mrs. Chen had been selling novels and local history for 20 years, Patterson's barbershop where 3 generations of the same family had been cutting hair, and in the center of the block, Morgan's Cafe with its large windows and vintage sign. "I see a community," Thomas said slowly. "Exactly, a community that's been slowly losing pieces of itself. The bookstore's doing okay because Mrs. Chen owns the building outright, and her overhead is low. The barbershop survives because Bill Patterson's been there so long he's an institution. But the cafe—" Marcus shook his head. "The cafe used to be the heart of this block, place where people gathered, where deals got made, where neighbors became friends." Thomas studied the cafe more carefully, his architect's eye automatically assessing the structure. "The building has good bones," he said without thinking. "It does," Marcus agreed, and Thomas realized he'd been led into revealing more than he'd intended. Good bones, good location, good natural light. What it doesn't have is someone who knows how to make the most of those advantages. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sparse foot traffic on Main Street. A few customers entered and left the cafe, but nothing like the steady stream that a business of that size needed to thrive. "Marcus," Thomas said carefully, "hypothetically, if someone wanted to help Miriam improve the cafe's prospects, what kind of community support might be available?" Marcus's smile was knowing but not smug. "Hypothetically? Well, I'd have to imagine that a lot of folks in this town remember when that cafe was thriving. Mrs. Chen still talks about the poetry readings they used to host there. Bill Patterson mentions the coffee and conversation he used to enjoy on Sunday mornings. Even Principal Hart has commented on how much she misses having a decent place to grab lunch during the school day." He moved behind the counter, pulling out a worn notebook filled with supplier contacts and vendor information. "Hypothetically, if someone with the right knowledge proposed a renovation plan that could help the cafe succeed, I think there'd be people willing to contribute materials at cost. Maybe some volunteer labor from folks who have skills but not much disposable cash." Thomas felt his heart rate accelerate. "That's a big hypothetical." "It is," Marcus agreed. "Would require someone willing to take the lead, someone who understood not just what needed to be done, but how to coordinate the doing of it. Someone with experience managing complex projects." The implication hung between them like a bridge that Thomas could either cross or burn. "I haven't done work like that in a long time," Thomas said quietly. I imagine it's like riding a bicycle, Marcus replied. Some skills you never really lose, even when you convince yourself you have. Thomas thought about the sketches on his kitchen table, about the confidence that had surprised him when his hand had moved across the paper with remembered precision. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe some skills live deeper than conscious memory, waiting for the right moment to resurface. If, and I'm saying if, someone were to propose such a project, how would they approach Miriam without making her feel like charity case? Marcus considered this carefully. Miriam's got pride, and she's got reasons for it. Any approach would have to respect that. Maybe start small. Offer to fix some minor problems as a neighborly gesture. Let her see the difference that professional knowledge can make without making it feel like pity. And if the small fixes led to bigger conversations about bigger changes, then you'd need to present it as an investment in the community, not a handout to one family. Show her how a thriving cafe benefits everyone, brings people downtown, supports other businesses, gives families a place to gather. Make it about building something stronger for everyone, not just saving what's failing. Thomas nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in Marcus's approach. He'd learned long ago that the best architectural solutions addressed not just immediate problems, but the larger context in which those problems existed. Hypothetically, Thomas said, how soon could materials be available? Marcus's grin was answer enough. An hour later, Thomas left the hardware store with a receipt for wood stain and cleaning supplies, but more importantly, with a notebook full of supplier contacts and a preliminary list of volunteers who might be willing to contribute time and skills to a community project. Marcus had been thinking about this for longer than their phone conversation had revealed, and his quiet groundwork had laid the foundation for something that might actually be possible. Walking back toward the school for his afternoon shift, Thomas found himself detouring past the cafe again. This time, instead of simply observing, he studied the building with the focused attention of a professional. The large front windows were an asset, but they needed better lighting design to make the interior feel welcoming, even on gray days like today. The entrance was poorly configured, creating a bottleneck that made the space feel smaller than it actually was. The seating arrangement prioritized maximum capacity over customer comfort and traffic flow. But underneath the problems, Thomas could see the potential. With some strategic modifications, nothing major, nothing that would require permits or massive construction, the space could be transformed into something that felt both intimate and spacious, both cozy and professional. As he stood there sketching mental notes, the door opened and Lila emerged, followed by her mother. Miriam was carrying a small bag of what looked like day-old pastries, probably taking home whatever hadn't sold rather than let it go to waste. Lila spotted Thomas immediately and waved enthusiastically. "Mr. Thomas, are you coming to have coffee at our cafe?" Miriam's cheeks flushed slightly. "Lila, Mr. Thomas is probably busy." Actually, Thomas heard himself saying, "I was hoping I could come in for a few minutes. There are some small maintenance issues I noticed that I might be able to help with. Nothing major, just some neighborly assistance." Miriam's expression was a mixture of surprise, wariness, and something that might have been hope. "You don't have to." "I'd like to," Thomas said simply, "if you have time." Lila looked between the two adults, her perceptive eyes clearly recognizing something significant in the moment, even if she didn't understand all the implications. "Can he, Mama? Can Mr. Thomas help fix things?" Miriam studied Thomas's face for a long moment, and he had the sense that she was weighing not just his offer but the man behind it. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said quietly. "Come in and tell me what you see." As Thomas followed them back into the cafe, he felt the same mixture of excitement and terror that had accompanied his first major architectural commission 25 years earlier. He was about to step out of the shadows and into the light, and there would be no going back. The interior of Morgan's cafe was both better and worse than Thomas had expected. Better because the basic structure was sound. High ceilings with exposed beams that spoke of solid craftsmanship, hardwood floors that had good bones beneath the coffee stains and wear patterns, and those large windows that could flood the space with natural light when properly utilized. Worse, because he could see, with professional clarity, just how close the business was to complete failure. The vintage espresso machine that David had been so proud of sat behind the counter like a beautiful but dying patient, its chrome exterior polished to a shine that couldn't hide the concerning sounds it made with each use. The fluorescent light above the register flickered intermittently, casting harsh shadows that made the already tired space feel even more uninviting. The seating arrangement was a maze of mismatched tables and chairs that had been acquired piecemeal over the years, creating bottlenecks that slowed service and isolated customers from each other. But it was the small details that told the real story of struggle. The hand-lettered signs advertising daily specials were written on cardboard because the proper menu boards had broken months ago. Extension cords snaked across the floor to power equipment that should have been hardwired, creating both safety hazards and visual clutter. The paint on the walls, once a cheerful yellow, had faded to a tired cream, marked with scuffs and water stains that spoke of deferred maintenance and depleted resources. "It's not much to look at right now," Miriam said quietly, following Thomas's professional assessment with obvious embarrassment. "I know it needs work, but—" "It has incredible potential," Thomas interrupted, meaning every word. "The structure is solid, the location is perfect, and the natural light is exceptional. These aren't problems, they're opportunities." Lila had claimed a small table near the window and pulled out her ever-present art supplies, sketching contentedly while the adults talked. But Thomas noticed that she was listening carefully to every word, her young mind processing the conversation with the same perceptive intelligence she brought to everything else. Thomas moved through the space slowly, his trained eye cataloging both problems and possibilities. The electrical issues were mostly cosmetic. The flickering light needed a new ballast. The extension cords could be eliminated with some basic rewiring that wouldn't require pulling permits. The floor could be restored to its original beauty with proper sanding and refinishing. The seating arrangement could be completely reconfigured to improve traffic flow and create distinct zones for different types of customers. "The espresso machine," he said, approaching the temperamental equipment. "How long has it been making that grinding sound?" Miriam's laugh held no humor. "About 6 months. I've been told it needs a new grinder assembly, but the part costs more than I make in a good week." Thomas examined the machine carefully, noting the model and year. It was a quality piece of equipment, well worth repairing rather than replacing. "I might know someone who works on these," he said carefully, "someone who could source the part at cost." "Thomas." Miriam's voice stopped him as he continued his circuit of the room. "Can I ask you something?" He turned to face her, noting the careful way she was choosing her words, the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested she was working up the courage to voice something difficult. "Lila mentioned that you understand buildings, that you know about construction and design, but you're the school janitor." "I don't mean that disrespectfully," she added quickly. I guess I'm wondering who you really are." The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that went far beyond casual curiosity. Thomas looked at Lila, still sketching at her table, creating another house with careful architectural details that spoke of an intuitive understanding of space and structure. Then he looked back at Miriam, seeing in her tired eyes the same desperate hope he'd once felt when everything he'd built was crashing down around him. "I used to be an architect," he said simply. "A long time ago, in another life." Miriam's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't push for details. "What happened?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much truth this moment could bear. "I made some mistakes. Lost confidence in my ability to make decisions that affected other people's lives. Decided it was safer to work with mops and brooms than blueprints and building plans." "But you still see things," Miriam said softly. "Still understand how spaces could work better." "Apparently so." Thomas managed a small smile. "Even when I try not to." Lila looked up from her drawing, her golden brown eyes moving between her mother and Thomas with that uncanny perceptiveness that seemed to run in the family. "Mr. Thomas," she said quietly, "are you going to help my mama fix our cafe?" The simple directness of the question cut through all the adult complexities of pride and fear and past failures. Thomas looked at this 8-year-old girl who drew houses where nobody cried, who shared her lunch with hungry classmates, who carried her mother's burdens without complaint, and felt something shift inside his chest. "I'd like to try," he said, "if your mama wants the help." Miriam was quiet for a long time, her gaze moving around the cafe as if seeing it through new eyes. "I can't pay you," she said finally. "I can barely keep the lights on as it is." "I'm not asking for payment," Thomas replied. "I'm asking for the chance to use skills I'd forgotten I still had." "Why?" The question was direct, challenging. "Why would you want to help strangers with problems that aren't your responsibility?" Thomas thought about Miguel Santos and James Morrison, about the weight of guilt that had driven him into exile, about the sketches on his kitchen table that had awakened something he'd thought was permanently buried. But most of all, he thought about Lila's confession. "My mommy cries every night." "Because sometimes helping other people is the only way to help yourself," he said quietly. Miriam studied his face for a long moment, and Thomas had the sense that she was looking not just at his words but at the man behind them, weighing not just his offer but his character. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said, "show me what you see." For the next hour, Thomas walked Miriam through the cafe as if he were presenting plans to a client, pointing out potential improvements with the confidence that came from decades of professional experience. He explained how rearranging the seating could improve traffic flow and create more intimate conversation areas. He described how strategic lighting could make the space feel warmer and more welcoming. He outlined simple structural modifications that could open up sight lines and make the small space feel larger. As he talked, Thomas watched Miriam's expression change from skeptical wariness to genuine interest to something that might have been excitement. She asked intelligent questions, offered insights about customer behavior and peak traffic patterns, and gradually began to see her failing cafe not as a burden, but as a canvas for transformation. "The thing is," Thomas said as he concluded his informal assessment, "none of these changes require major construction or significant expense. Most of what needs to happen is strategic reorganization, basic maintenance, and attention to details that make a space feel welcoming rather than desperate." "It sounds almost too good to be true," Miriam said quietly. "It's not magic," Thomas replied. "It's just professional knowledge applied to problems that have professional solutions." Lila had been listening to the entire conversation while continuing to work on her drawing. Now she held up her latest creation, a sketch of the cafe, but transformed. Gone were the harsh fluorescent lights and cramped seating arrangements. In their place, she'd drawn warm pendant lights, comfortable conversation areas, and walls lined with local artwork. At the center of the space, she'd drawn 3 figures: a woman behind the counter serving coffee with a genuine smile, a little girl at a corner table surrounded by friends, and a man fixing something in the background. "Is this your vision of the cafe?" Thomas asked, genuinely impressed by the sophistication of her design sense. "It's my vision of home," Lila said simply. "A place where people want to be, where good things happen, where nobody has to cry alone." The honesty of her words hit both adults like a physical force. Miriam's eyes filled with tears. Not the secret tears of despair that Lila had observed for months, but tears of possibility, of hope that, maybe, just maybe, their small world could be rebuilt into something stronger and more beautiful. "How do we start?" Miriam asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked around the cafe one more time, seeing not the tired space that existed, but the transformed space that could exist with enough care, knowledge, and community support. "We start small," he said, "with trust, with one repair at a time, with the belief that sometimes the most broken things can become the most beautiful." As they prepared to close the cafe for the evening, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. The excitement of a project beginning, the sense that his skills might actually matter again, the possibility that redemption could be built one careful decision at a time. Outside, the October evening was settling over Willowbrook, with the kind of gentle calm that made small towns feel like havens from a complicated world. But inside Morgan's cafe, 3 people were planning something that felt revolutionary in its simplicity. The transformation of a failing business into a thriving heart of community, guided by the quiet expertise of a man who had learned that sometimes the most important buildings are the ones that rebuild human hope. Thomas spent the next 3 nights at his kitchen table, working by lamplight while the rest of Willowbrook slept. The sketches that had begun as tentative possibilities evolved into detailed architectural plans. Floor layouts, electrical schematics, lighting designs, and material specifications that transformed the cafe from a struggling business into a warm, welcoming community space. His hands moved across the paper with growing confidence, muscle memory awakening after 15 years of dormancy. The design that emerged was both practical and inspired. Thomas had reorganized the seating to create distinct zones. Intimate 2-person tables near the windows for quiet conversations, a large communal table in the center for meetings and laptop work, and comfortable armchairs arranged around a low coffee table for casual gatherings. He'd specified warm pendant lighting to replace the harsh fluorescence, designed built-in shelving for books and local artwork, and planned a small performance area where poetry readings or acoustic music could bring the community together. Most importantly, every modification was designed to be accomplished with minimal expense and maximum community involvement. The electrical work required basic rewiring that any competent electrician could handle in a weekend. The furniture could be refinished rather than replaced. The lighting fixtures were simple designs that could be constructed from readily available materials. The built-in shelving utilized standard lumber and configurations that required skill but not specialized tools. On Thursday afternoon, Lila appeared at the school earlier than usual, her face bright with anticipation. She found Thomas in the supply closet, organizing cleaning materials with the same methodical precision he brought to architectural planning. "Mr. Thomas," she said, bouncing slightly on her toes, "Mama said you might come to the cafe again today. She's been talking about your ideas all week. She even smiled at breakfast this morning, really smiled, not the pretend kind." Thomas felt a warmth spread through his chest at the thought of Miriam's genuine smile. "I do have some drawings I'd like to show her," he admitted. "But first, I wanted to ask you something." Lila's eyes widened with interest. "What?" Thomas pulled out a folded piece of paper, one of his preliminary sketches from the first night's work. "I've been thinking about what you said, about creating a place where people want to be. I wondered if you might want to help me design something special." He unfolded the paper to reveal a corner of the cafe he'd left deliberately unfinished, a small alcove near the front window with built-in seating and natural light. "This could be a reading nook, or an art corner, or whatever you think would make the space more welcoming for children and families." Lila studied the drawing with the serious attention of someone much older than 8. Could it be a place where kids could draw while their parents have coffee, with good light and maybe a little shelf for art supplies? "Absolutely," Thomas said, genuinely impressed by her practical thinking. "What else would make it special?" Lila was quiet for a moment, her finger tracing the lines of his sketch. "Could there be a bulletin board where kids could hang their artwork? And maybe some books that families could read together?" "Those are excellent ideas," Thomas said, making notes on the margin of the drawing. "Anything else?" "A window seat," Lila said decisively, "with cushions where someone could sit and watch the street and feel safe and warm inside." Thomas nodded, already visualizing how the built-in bench seating could incorporate storage underneath, and how the right cushions could make the space feel like a cozy retreat within the larger cafe. "I think your mother is going to love these additions. Will you tell her they were my ideas?" Lila asked, and Thomas heard something vulnerable in her voice. The need for a child to contribute meaningfully to her family's well-being. "I'll tell her this whole corner was designed by my consulting architect," Thomas said solemnly, "Ms. Lila Morgan, specialist in spaces that make people happy." Lila's giggle was pure joy, the sound of a child who felt valued and heard and important in ways that mattered. That afternoon, Thomas found Miriam at the cafe during the slow period between lunch and dinner rush. She was behind the counter, methodically cleaning the temperamental espresso machine with the kind of determined care that spoke of someone fighting to maintain standards despite overwhelming obstacles. "Miriam," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, and Thomas was struck by the change in her expression since their last conversation. The defensive wariness had softened into something more open, more hopeful. "Thomas, I was hoping you'd come by. I've been thinking about what you said, about the possibilities." Thomas spread his detailed drawings across the largest table, weighing down the corners with coffee cups to keep them flat. "I wanted to show you what those possibilities might look like." For the next hour, Thomas walked Miriam through his vision for the transformed cafe, explaining each modification with the patience of someone who understood that good design required not just technical knowledge, but emotional buy-in from the people who would live and work in the space. He showed her how the new seating arrangement would improve both traffic flow and intimate conversation. He demonstrated how strategic lighting could make the space feel twice as large and infinitely more welcoming. He explained how the children's corner that Lila had helped design would draw families and create a sense of community gathering place. As he talked, Thomas watched Miriam's posture change. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing deepened, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked like a woman imagining success rather than bracing for failure. "It's beautiful," she said quietly when he finished. "But Thomas, I have to ask, how much would something like this cost? Because I'm barely keeping the lights on as it is." Thomas had anticipated this question and had spent considerable time working with Marcus's supplier contacts to develop realistic cost estimates. "That's the remarkable thing," he said. "Most of these modifications require labor and creativity more than expensive materials. Marcus has already reached out to some suppliers who'd be willing to provide materials at cost. And there are people in this community who have skills they'd be willing to contribute." Miriam's eyes widened. "People would really help?" "Miriam, this cafe matters to this community in ways you might not realize. Mrs. Chen from the bookstore still talks about the poetry readings you used to host here. Bill Patterson mentions the Sunday morning conversations he misses. Even Principal Hart has commented on how much she misses having a decent place for lunch." Thomas pulled out a notebook that Marcus had given him, filled with names and contact information. "Marcus has already spoken to an electrician who'd handle the rewiring for the cost of materials. There's a carpenter who'd build the shelving in exchange for coffee and pastries for his crew. Mrs. Chen has offered to coordinate a book donation for the reading corner." Tears had begun to gather in Miriam's eyes. Not the secret tears of despair that Lila had witnessed for months, but tears of overwhelming gratitude and possibility. "Why would people do this? I can't repay that kind of generosity." "You don't need to repay it," Thomas said gently. "You need to receive it. And then, when the cafe is thriving again, you'll naturally find ways to give back to the community that supported you." Miriam was quiet for a long time, studying the drawings with the intensity of someone trying to believe that dreams could become reality. Finally, she looked up at Thomas with an expression he'd never seen before, hope mixed with determination and the beginning of genuine excitement. "Where do we start?" she asked. Thomas smiled, feeling the same thrill he'd experienced 25 years earlier, when a client had given him permission to transform their vision into reality. "We start with the foundation, literally and figuratively. Small repairs first, building trust and momentum. Then we tackle the bigger changes once everyone can see how the improvements make a difference." "And you'll guide the project?" The question carried weight beyond simple project management. Miriam was asking if he'd step fully out of the shadows, take responsibility for coordinating skilled work that could affect the livelihood of her family and the well-being of the community. Thomas thought about Miguel Santos and James Morrison, about the 15 years he'd spent running from the possibility of being responsible for other people's lives. Then he thought about Lila's drawing of a house where nobody cried, about Miriam's genuine smile that morning, about the community of people who'd been quietly waiting for someone to help them help each other. "Yes," he said simply, "I'll guide the project." As they gathered up the drawings and prepared to close the cafe for the evening, Thomas felt something shifting inside him, not the erasure of his past mistakes, but the integration of hard-learned wisdom with rekindled purpose. For the first time in 15 years, Thomas Reyes was ready to build something beautiful, something that mattered, something that could transform not just a physical space, but the lives of the people who gathered within it. Outside, the October evening was crisp, with the promise of changing seasons. Inside Morgan's cafe, a woman and a man were planning a transformation that would require not just architectural skill, but faith in the power of community, hope, and second chances. Thomas arrived at the cafe early Saturday morning to find Miriam already there, pacing behind the counter with nervous energy. She'd been awake since 4 o'clock, alternating between excitement about the renovation plans and terror about accepting help she wasn't sure she deserved. The detailed drawings Thomas had shown her earlier in the week lay spread across the corner table, held down with coffee mugs and weighted with possibility. "I keep looking at these plans," Miriam said without preamble when Thomas entered, "and thinking this is too good to be true. Things like this don't happen to people like me." Thomas set down his toolbox, the first he'd owned in 15 years, assembled quietly over the past week from Marcus's shop. "What do you mean, people like you?" Miriam gestured around the struggling cafe, her voice carrying a bitterness that spoke of months of accumulated failure. "People who make bad choices. People whose husbands walk out. People who can't even keep a simple coffee shop afloat in a town where everybody knows everybody else." "Miriam!" "No, let me finish." She turned to face him, her golden brown eyes bright with unshed tears and barely contained emotion. "I keep asking myself why you're really doing this. What's in it for you? because in my experience, when something seems too good to be true, it usually is. The accusation hung between them like a wall, built from months of disappointment and reinforced by the kind of defensive pride that develops when someone has been hurt too many times. Thomas recognized the stance. He'd worn it himself for 15 years. The armor of someone who'd learned that trusting others with important things led to devastating consequences. "You think I have ulterior motives," Thomas said quietly. "I think you're a janitor who claims to be an architect, offering to coordinate a renovation that could save my business and my family, asking for nothing in return." Miriam's voice rose slightly. "Either you're lying about who you are, or you're lying about what you want, or you're lying about what this will actually cost. Because people don't just fix other people's lives out of kindness." Thomas felt the familiar weight of judgment settling on his shoulders, the assumption that his motives must be suspect because his offer seemed too generous. But underneath Miriam's accusations, he heard something else. The voice of a woman who'd been disappointed by promises before, who'd learned to protect herself and her daughter by expecting the worst from well-meaning strangers. "You're right to be suspicious," he said finally. "I am getting something out of this. I'm getting the chance to use skills I thought I'd lost forever. I'm getting the opportunity to build something beautiful, instead of just maintaining what already exists. I'm getting the possibility of redemption after 15 years of believing I was too dangerous to trust with important work." Miriam's expression shifted slightly, confusion replacing some of the defensive anger. "What do you mean, too dangerous?" It was then that Lila entered from the apartment upstairs, drawn by the sound of raised voices and the tension that filled the cafe like smoke. She took in the scene quickly. Her mother's defensive posture, Thomas's careful stillness, the architectural drawings scattered across the table like evidence of dreams that might be too fragile to survive scrutiny. "Are you fighting?" Lila asked quietly, her young voice carrying the weight of a child who'd witnessed too many adult conflicts. "We're having a discussion," Miriam said, her tone softening automatically in her daughter's presence. But Lila's perceptive gaze moved between the two adults, reading the undercurrents that polite words couldn't hide. "Mama, are you scared about the cafe project?" The simple directness of the question cut through all the adult complexities of pride and fear and past disappointments. Miriam looked at her daughter, seeing not just an 8-year-old but a person who'd been carrying adult worries, who deserved honesty about the decisions that would affect her future. "Yes," Miriam admitted, "I'm scared." "Of what?" Miriam glanced at Thomas, then back at her daughter. "I'm scared of hoping for something and having it not work out. I'm scared of accepting help and then finding out there are strings attached. I'm scared of trusting someone and being disappointed again." Lila nodded solemnly, as if she understood the weight of these fears in ways that most children her age wouldn't. Then she walked over to Thomas, studying his face with the same careful attention she brought to her artwork. "Mr. Thomas," she said quietly, "are you really an architect?" The question was asked without judgment, without accusation, but with the simple need for truth that children brought to important conversations. Thomas crouched down so they were at eye level, recognizing that his answer to this child would determine not just the fate of the renovation project, but the possibility of healing wounds that went far deeper than building repairs. "Yes," he said simply, "I really am an architect. I went to school for it, I practiced it for 20 years, and I designed buildings that people lived and worked in." "Then why are you a janitor now?" Thomas felt Miriam's attention sharpen, understanding that his answer would address not just Lila's curiosity, but her mother's suspicions about his motives and his character. "Because I made a mistake," Thomas said carefully. "A building I designed had an accident during construction. 2 men died, and even though it wasn't my fault legally, I blamed myself. I was so afraid of making another mistake that might hurt someone that I stopped being an architect and became a janitor instead." Lila was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the seriousness it deserved. "But you want to be an architect again?" "I want to help your mother save the cafe," Thomas said, "and yes, I suppose that means I want to be an architect again, at least for this project." "Even though you're scared of making mistakes?" The question pierced straight to the heart of Thomas's 15-year struggle with guilt and responsibility. "Yes, even though I'm scared?" Lila turned to her mother. "Mama, if Mr. Thomas is scared but wants to help anyway, doesn't that mean he's brave?" Miriam stared at her daughter, seeing in her 8-year-old wisdom a clarity that adult fears had obscured. Then she looked at Thomas. Really looked at him, seeing not a suspicious stranger offering charity, but a man carrying his own burdens, offering his own form of courage. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I was so focused on protecting myself and Leela from disappointment that I didn't consider you might be taking a risk too." Thomas stood slowly, feeling something release in his chest. "We're all taking risks," he said. "You're risking hope after disappointment. I'm risking responsibility after failure. But maybe that's what real change requires. The willingness to be vulnerable again." Lila moved to the table where the architectural drawings lay spread out, studying them with renewed interest. "If we're all scared but we do it anyway, does that make us a team?" The simple question hung in the air like a bridge between fear and possibility. Miriam joined her daughter at the table, looking at the drawings not as impossible dreams but as achievable goals that would require courage from everyone involved. "I have conditions," she said finally, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. "Name them," Thomas replied. "First, we do this as partners, not as charity. I contribute what I can, labor, materials, whatever's within my means. Second, if at any point this becomes more than I can handle financially or emotionally, we stop without anyone feeling guilty. Third, we're honest with each other about problems, setbacks, and concerns as they arise." Thomas nodded. "Those are fair conditions. I have one of my own." "What's that?" "If I make recommendations that don't feel right to you, you tell me. This is your business, your family, your future. I'm here to provide expertise and guidance, but the final decisions are yours." Lila looked up from the drawings, her face bright with excitement. "And I get to help design the children's corner?" "You get to help design the children's corner," Thomas confirmed. Miriam extended her hand to Thomas, not as someone accepting charity, but as someone entering into partnership. "All right then, let's build something beautiful." As Thomas shook her hand, he felt the weight of 15 years of self-imposed exile finally beginning to lift. He was no longer running from his past mistakes, but walking toward a future where those mistakes had taught him wisdom, instead of paralyzing him with fear. Outside, the October morning was bright with autumn sunshine, the kind of light that made everything seem possible. Inside Morgan's cafe, 3 people were beginning a project that would transform not just a physical space, but their understanding of what could be accomplished when courage, community, and second chances came together in the right proportions. Word spread through Willowbrook with the gentle efficiency that characterized small-town communication. Marcus had been carefully discreet in his conversations with potential volunteers. But by Wednesday morning, the cafe renovation had become the kind of community project that gave people a reason to feel hopeful about their town's future. Mrs. Chen from the bookstore was the first to arrive, carrying a box of books and a thermos of green tea. She found Thomas and Miriam reviewing electrical plans at the corner table, Lila adding careful artistic details to the margins of the architectural drawings. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Mrs. Chen said with characteristic politeness, "but Marcus mentioned you might be creating a reading corner. I thought these books might find a good home here." The box contained a carefully curated selection of children's books, local history volumes, and poetry collections, the kind of thoughtful literary mix that had made Mrs. Chen's bookstore a beloved community resource for 2 decades. "This is incredibly generous," Miriam said, clearly moved by the gesture. "Nonsense," Mrs. Chen replied briskly. "Books need readers, and readers need comfortable places to gather. This benefits everyone." She was followed by Bill Patterson from the barber shop, who arrived with a measuring tape and a notebook full of ideas about built-in seating. Then came Elena Rodriguez, a retired teacher who'd heard about the project from her neighbor and wanted to contribute painting expertise. By noon, the cafe had become an impromptu planning center, with community members stopping by to offer skills, materials, and encouragement. Principal Evelyn Hart arrived during the lunch rush, her expression carefully neutral as she observed the unusual level of activity. She found Thomas coordinating with the volunteer electrician, Jim Morrison. No relation to the construction worker who died in Thomas's building collapse, but the coincidence of names had caused Thomas a moment of internal vertigo. "Thomas," Evelyn said formally, "might I have a word?" They stepped outside, where the October air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter's approach. Evelyn studied Thomas's face, with the sharp attention that had made her an effective principal for nearly 2 decades. "I've been hearing interesting things about your background," she said without preamble. Thomas felt his shoulders tense. "What kind of things?" "Marcus Taylor mentioned that you have architectural training." Mrs. Chen said you've been coordinating a renovation project with the kind of professional expertise that goes beyond casual DIY knowledge. Evelyn paused, choosing her words carefully. "I'm beginning to wonder if I've been underestimating one of my employees." The admission was clearly difficult for her, a woman who prided herself on understanding the people under her supervision. Thomas recognized the discomfort of someone discovering that their assumptions had been incomplete, possibly unfair. "I used to practice architecture," Thomas said simply. "I don't anymore." "But you're practicing it now," Evelyn observed. "This renovation project, it's not the work of a hobbyist. It's professional-level design and project management." Thomas looked through the cafe windows, where Lila was showing her latest artwork to a small group of volunteer supporters. "Sometimes circumstances require us to remember skills we thought we'd left behind." Evelyn followed his gaze, taking in the scene of community collaboration that had developed around the renovation project. "Thomas, I owe you an apology. When I warned you about overstepping your role, I was operating from assumptions about your capabilities and your place in this community. I was wrong." The apology carried weight beyond simple politeness. In acknowledging her mistake, Evelyn was also acknowledging that value and expertise could exist in unexpected places, that job titles didn't always reflect the full measure of a person's abilities or contributions. "You were protecting the students," Thomas said. "That's your job." "It is, but it's also my job to recognize and support the talents of everyone in our school community. I failed to do that with you, and I'm sorry." Inside the cafe, the afternoon had taken on the atmosphere of a community barn raising, with different groups of volunteers tackling various aspects of the renovation. The electrician was running new wiring with the help of his teenage son, who was learning the trade through hands-on experience. Elena Rodriguez and 2 other women were preparing the walls for painting, their conversation punctuated by laughter and stories about their own home improvement adventures. Thomas moved between the different work areas with the confidence of someone who understood not just the technical requirements of each task but the social dynamics of coordinating volunteer labor. He answered questions, solved problems, and made small adjustments to the plan based on real-world discoveries that emerged as the work progressed. "You know," Marcus said, appearing at Thomas's elbow with a cup of coffee, "I haven't seen this kind of community energy in years. People working together on something that matters, using skills they don't often get to share." Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully, taking a moment to observe the coordinated activity around them. "It's remarkable what happens when people feel like they can make a real difference." "Speaking of making a difference," Marcus said, lowering his voice slightly, "I've been thinking about what happens after this project is finished, about whether there might be other ways the community could benefit from your particular expertise." Before Thomas could respond, Lila appeared at his side, tugging gently on his sleeve. "Mr. Thomas, could you help me with something?" She led him to the children's corner, where the built-in seating was taking shape under Bill Patterson's skilled carpentry. The window seat that Lila had envisioned was emerging exactly as she'd drawn it, complete with storage compartments underneath and cushioned surfaces that would invite hours of comfortable reading. "It's perfect," she said, her voice filled with satisfaction. "Just like I imagined it, but real." "That's the magic of good planning," Thomas replied. "When you can see something clearly in your mind, you can usually figure out how to build it in reality." Lila was quiet for a moment, studying the work in progress. "Mr. Thomas, after we finish making the cafe beautiful, will you go back to being just a janitor?" The question carried implications that went far beyond simple curiosity. Thomas realized that this 8-year-old girl who'd been the catalyst for everything that had followed was asking about the permanence of transformation, whether people could really change, whether hope could be sustained beyond the completion of a single project. "I don't think I'll ever be just a janitor again," Thomas said thoughtfully. "Once you remember that you have skills that can help people, it's hard to pretend you don't." "Good," Lila said with the decisive satisfaction of someone who'd been worried about exactly that possibility. "Because Mama smiles now when she thinks nobody's looking. Real smiles, not the pretend kind. And I think that's partly because of you." As the afternoon wore on, the cafe continued its transformation. The harsh, fluorescent lighting gave way to warm pendant fixtures that cast inviting pools of light throughout the space. The cramped, inefficient seating arrangement was replaced by carefully planned zones that created both intimate conversation areas and communal gathering spaces. The walls, freshly painted in warm earth tones that complemented the exposed brick, provided the perfect backdrop for local artwork that would rotate monthly. Most importantly, the space began to feel like what it was becoming. Not just a business struggling to survive, but a community gathering place where neighbors could connect, families could relax, and the simple act of sharing coffee and conversation could strengthen the social fabric that held Willowbrook together. As evening approached and the volunteers began gathering their tools and preparing to leave, Thomas found himself standing in the center of the transformed space with Miriam and Lila. The renovation wasn't complete. There were still details to finish, equipment to repair, final touches to add, but the essential transformation had taken place. The cafe no longer felt like a space where dreams went to die. It felt like a place where hope could flourish. "Tomorrow we tackle the espresso machine," Thomas said, consulting his project's timeline. "Marcus found the replacement parts we need, and Jim thinks he can have it running like new by the end of the week." Miriam nodded, but her attention was focused on something else, the way the space felt now, the sense of possibility that seemed to emanate from every carefully planned detail. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "I haven't cried myself to sleep in a week." Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of genuine transformation. "For months, I went to bed every night terrified about the future, convinced that everything was falling apart. But this project, this community support, what you've made possible, it's given me something I'd forgotten I could have." "What's that?" Thomas asked. "Faith that tomorrow might be better than today." As they locked up the cafe and prepared to go their separate ways for the evening, Thomas felt a satisfaction deeper than any he'd experienced in his years as a practicing architect. The buildings he designed before had been impressive and functional, but this small cafe renovation had accomplished something more profound. It had rebuilt not just a physical space, but the human connections that made a community strong. Walking home through the quiet streets of Willowbrook, Thomas realized that the project was transforming him as much as it was transforming the cafe. For 15 years, he'd hidden his talents behind a janitor's uniform, convinced that his skills were too dangerous to use. But this project had proven that expertise applied with wisdom and humility could build rather than destroy, could heal rather than harm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new details to resolve, new problems to solve. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Thomas Reyes went to sleep not as a man running from his past, but as an architect building toward a future where his gifts could make a difference in the world. 3 weeks later, Morgan's Cafe reopened to a line of customers that stretched halfway down Main Street. The transformed space glowed with warm pendant lighting, filled with the rich aroma of properly brewed coffee and Miriam's freshly baked pastries. The vintage espresso machine hummed with restored efficiency, its chrome surface reflecting the satisfied faces of neighbors who had gathered to celebrate more than just a business reopening. Lila's artwork hung prominently on the wall behind the counter, her drawing of "The House Where No One Cries," now framed and labeled as the cafe's inspiration. Below it, a small plaque read, "Designed by our community architect consultant, Ms. Lila Morgan." Thomas stood near the back of the crowded space, watching Miriam serve coffee with genuine joy instead of desperate efficiency. Her smile reached her eyes now, and when she laughed at something, Mrs. Chen said, the sound was pure happiness. Lila sat in her perfect window seat reading corner, surrounded by friends from school who were discovering that the cafe had become their favorite after-school gathering place. "Thomas," Principal Hart appeared beside him, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I wanted to thank you properly." "For what?" "For reminding me that extraordinary people often hide in ordinary places. For showing me that sometimes the janitor sees what the principal misses." She paused, studying his face. "Marcus mentioned there might be other community projects that could benefit from your expertise." Thomas accepted the coffee, considering the possibility that his emergence from invisibility might be permanent rather than temporary. "I'm starting to think Willowbrook has more potential than any of us realized." Across the cafe, Lila looked up from her book and caught his eye. She smiled and gave him a small wave, then returned to her reading. A child finally free to be a child, secure in the knowledge that her mother's tears had been replaced by laughter, that their small world had been rebuilt stronger than before. As the evening wound down, and the last customers headed home, Thomas helped Miriam clean up, moving through the transformed space with quiet satisfaction. He had learned that redemption wasn't about erasing past mistakes, but about using hard-won wisdom to build something beautiful from the ruins. Outside, Willowbrook settled into peaceful evening quiet, but inside the cafe where nobody cried, hope had found a permanent home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.